Hi everyone, welcome to the TBR Webinar series. Today, Practice Manager Allan, Senior Analyst Cassandra and Meaghan, and Research Analyst Jack will be discussing obstacles and triumphs on the journey to cloud. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes at the bottom of your screens. You can access the slides, audio controls, Q&A, speaker bios, and our survey. After the webinar, you'll receive an email with a replay link, as well as a link to view and register for other TBR webinars. If you have any questions for us, please submit them via the Q&A widget in On24. You may also reach out to us after the event at webinars@tbri.com. Thank you again for joining us, and here's Allan to begin the webinar.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks everybody for joining. So before we get into today's webinar, I just wanted to orient you to what research this is coming from. So this shows our entire portfolio. A lot of it is vendor focus in terms of the reports and market landscapes. A lot of the insights, you'll see some of that insight today, but a lot of it comes from a fresh round of our customer studies, which are surveys and interviews, 200 surveys, 50 interviews for these reports that are just publishing. They're focused on infrastructure and platform workloads, and then separately a look at application workloads. So it's really kind of a conversation with adopters of cloud technologies in terms of what they're using, what they're evaluating, what's driving their consideration and investment in these solutions, as well as what the future looks like. And you'll hear a lot of that during today's discussion to go right to them and ask how they intend to use cloud, how much, and for what use cases they plan on over the next, say, 3 to 5 years as they plan their roadmap going forward. And so that's where a lot of the quotes and graphs and insights that you'll see today come from. And so just kind of starting with the title of today's webinar, when you think about the journey that a lot of customers have been on, initially it was to implement some form of cloud within their environments. And that's kind of snowballed to a point where for a lot of customers, they already have a multi-cloud environment. They continue to operate with traditional IT as well. And so, what started as a journey to cloud has really evolved into a journey to hybrid IT, which goes deeper into their organization in terms of workloads, and also the business problems that they're solving get deeper as well. We've been doing a number of studies with clients that look at really kind of those core ERP workloads, financials, manufacturing process, supply chain, the state of those, because for a lot of customers, they've moved a lot of the kind of low-hanging fruit, less mission-critical type workloads to cloud environments. And so for a lot of the vendors in that space, it's very present for them to understand how customers and when they're going to be moving to those deeper workloads that they focus on in terms of those ERP suites. So the journey has definitely changed, and we'll kind of call that out as we go through today's presentation. So the 3 sections, and you'll hear from each of the analysts here that are joining me. So first, kind of start with a state of the cloud in terms of adoption, overall levels in terms of delivery methods and the types of workloads, to kind of get a status for how deep that looks today from the customer research. And then here, really kind of that qualitative context is a big focus for the studies that we do, because, beyond just everybody deploying workloads on AWS or migrating to Salesforce, there's a lot of kind of context behind those decisions that get at, again, those more mission-critical, more customized to the business type use cases that a lot of customers are looking at, either have just done or are looking forward to over the next 3 to 5 years. And so that qualitative aspect is really important. And so we'll cover some of the decision-making from CXOs, CIOs in particular, for how they're looking at workloads. And then from a market perspective, the horizontal functions and workloads, especially with infrastructure and platform, are consolidating around a handful of vendors. So we'll cover that vendor landscape, but it hasn't changed a lot. Really isn't the most interesting perspective on cloud, we believe. But where more of that nuance and diversity comes in is with industries and geographies. And so we'll share some of the insight for within more specific workloads that are getting closer to retail or financial services, healthcare, what's coming together in terms of solution sets that are aligning to those deeper solutions that are really aligned to those verticals. And so that'll be the last section that we cover with today. So again, here's kind of that snapshot. We've had this graph, I think, probably going back at least 5 years in terms of our adoption studies. We've definitely seen a leveling off in terms of the levels of adoption. This shows, vast majority for most, even private cloud, for instance, that a lot of customers have either in a hosted environment or with management through their own data centers, implemented some of those private environments, so it's not quite the unknown obstacle that it was perceived as rewinding perhaps even like 2 years if you look at how some of those adoption levels have changed. But again, I think the change over time is one of the more important aspects. It just goes to supporting that, again, the journey may have started with a initial migration to cloud. Most customers have done that. So really they're setting their sights on deeper, more, and really applying it in the right use cases going forward, but solving things that are deeper than just cost savings, which, again, as tying back to that journey conversation, it may have started as an initial migration. A lot of it was driven by a financial motive for customers to reduce or delay cost. But just like the journey has changed, the motives have changed as well. So being able to manage more complex environments that have cropped up and use it for things that touch the business more directly, definitely, a shift in terms of the motives that we're seeing as well. So starting in on that, well, what's next? Where do customers want to go? What do we think it means for the market? This gives you an idea for the primary strategy that customers are planning to use going forward and how they see all of the diversity and choice that they now have settling out. It's focused, in this case, on infrastructure and platform adopters, so specific conversations about those workloads. And if we look at, for a majority, 50% of customers, they're either looking at integrating cloud with traditional IT, or on the bottom, having some type of integrated cloud solution that will be their primary source for infrastructure and platform as a service moving forward. And so, I think in terms of the variety of delivery methods, customers are more comfortable than they've ever been in terms of what hosted private means, what private means, and where public fits in their overall environment. And about 50% are going to be mixing all of those together in terms of sourcing their infrastructure. And then in the middle, you have some folks that are either going to go all in on a private environment or a public. But really the delivery method, I think, speaks to one aspect of that, but is an important one in terms of that overall transition to hybrid, and how we believe this will even change over time as more customers, reach critical mass with either an all public or all private environment. I think you're always going to have those cases where things are going to remain on-prem or straddle those delivery methods, but it's going to be very difficult, I think, for customers to really select one and go in its entirety into that one delivery method for their infrastructure and platform strategy. All right, so we'll have Cassandra kind of expand upon that message and look at, again, when we look forward, what customers are thinking about in terms of how their cloud strategy is going to change.
Yep, so just to orient you to the graph before we get going on the slide. So basically, we just asked the respondents how they felt about their cloud adoption strategy in regards to maturity. Did they think that they were on par with others, ahead of the curve, behind the curve, et cetera? And so this is actually a new question that we just added to the studies, and I'm really glad we did. I really like what it shows, and I think it really shows how, CIOs are really starting to understand where they're at. And it was great to kind of have them talk really openly and candidly with us about it as well in the interviews. And so as you can see from this graph, if you look at all of the bars except for the far left, most organizations have yet to crest kind of that cloud maturity curve. And, they're looking at their cloud adoption as kind of somewhat mature at best, meaning there's still a lot of room for growth. There's still a lot of room for integration across different environments. They might have a multi-cloud strategy, but that's not hybrid in the sense that the clouds are integrated for the sharing of data, et cetera. And so while this presents kind of an ongoing opportunity for cloud vendors and SIs, it also showcases that there's still quite a few obstacles in the way in terms of enterprise cloud adoption, whether it's organizational change or cost, time upfront, education or skill sets of the IT staff, and even sometimes CFO and CIO conflict around the shift from CapEx to OpEx and how you quantify your ROI and TCO. And I also think, too, that enterprises are generally more knowledgeable about cloud and the idea that just simply by having cloud or multiple clouds does not necessarily equate to maturity. And it's really now about they're really understanding the uplift required and how maturity is often more about integrating so that you can share data and really obtain those, business outcomes, so to speak. And so for quite a few respondents that we talked to, they have cloud visions that don't necessarily match their realities, unfortunately. One CIO said, and I'm absolutely paraphrasing, but he basically said that for now in the foreseeable future, it's AWS. But they also know that they don't want to have all of their eggs in one basket and want to use, or have been at least talking about, utilizing Azure as a warm site in case something happens to AWS, which I thought was an interesting phrase. And then, kind of build processes around a more cloud-ready, almost to infrastructure as a service environment. He said, we're not there yet, but that's where we want to be. And once we get there, that's when I think we'll really have a mature cloud posture. So I think that that's a great way to highlight and summarize a lot of the sentiment that we got throughout the survey, throughout the conversations with the CIOs. But then there was one that I wanted to highlight that's kind of on the flip side. So he's a CIO in the hospitality space, and I think he's one of the very select few who falls in that mature category to the far left of the graph. So he started with wanting to move 4 apps to the cloud, but there were 4 very cumbersome, highly utilized, very widespread applications like their central reservation system. So in just moving those 4 apps, he ended up moving over 20 because of the nature of the supporting apps around those big 4, so to speak. And in moving those 20 apps, he offloaded 70% of his compute power from his data center. And then realizing, okay, now we have 30% left. What can we do to offload that as well? And so basically, he moved it into what he called a managed colo environment, into Rackspace. And so he basically, instead of the difference between that and a regular colo environment is that he even had Rackspace as a third party, manage and upkeep his software licenses. And he, swept the floors and closed the doors, so to speak, on his on-prem data center, which I think is a very mature, I think he's by no means kind of the norm, but I think it's a very mature cloud strategy and a great kind of use case for that. And it does have its benefits and its drawbacks. I mean, he had to let go quite a few IT staff because of that. And I think that we'll see more CIOs get to that point, but I think it'll take years for that to happen, and he's definitely a first mover. All right, so now we're going to get a little bit more into kind of from the mouth of the CIO, so to speak. And so what we wanted to do here before we get into the rest of the presentation is kind of set the stage and how we're seeing especially the infrastructure and infrastructure and platform markets progress over the next 5 years. And so, the way we forecast these markets is taking both what the vendors are doing and reporting and combining that with what we're seeing and hearing from our end user research, like this survey that we're highlighting today. And across the board, hybrid's the name of the game. And while a lot of organizations have both public and private cloud, the spend is heavily weighted towards public cloud, especially when you look at the more cost-effective kind of compute workloads that are better suited for a public cloud environment, or some of your line of business apps that may be less mission critical. And I think one thing that's going to disrupt this mix of public to private going forward is these kind of hybrid infrastructure and PaaS solutions like Azure Stack, like AWS Outpost that's going to be coming out at some point soon. And these kind of help provide that middle ground because they're not public cloud native, and yet they help customers gain the benefit of cloud while staying on-prem or in their colo environments.
Right, and I think this is Meaghan speaking. One of the really interesting things about those sort of on-premise private clouds that Cassandra just mentioned, being Azure Stack and AWS Outpost, while on the face of it they really are, they are a different sort of flavor of cloud for customers who were not necessarily ready to move to public cloud. We see those in the long term also driving public cloud growth just by the nature of getting customers comfortable with vendor-managed environments, sort of getting customers on the track. It's a much easier stepping stone for many customers to be working still behind their own firewall, but in a vendor-managed environment. And the integrations between those offerings and the truly hosted public cloud environments offered by the same vendors is becoming more and more seamless and really going to enable customers in the long run to either burst to public cloud instances where their capacity may be saturated on-prem, or really truly migrate workloads to public cloud just for that little extra bit of cost savings when they're comfortable with the security of the services and things like that. So it's really going to create this sort of in-the-moment hybrid environment, but also sort of an even more dynamic and complex sort of long-term cloud strategy. And so I think one vendor that's really embracing that messaging right now is Microsoft. They're building out not only sort of their hosted cloud options, but obviously one of the earlier entrants into this on-prem private cloud market with Azure Stack sort of coming at the earlier end of things, and AWS kind of bucking its normal trend as the innovator and being a couple of years late to that game. But Microsoft in particular is really embracing sort of this hybrid cloud and hybrid IT storyline, leveraging some of its on-premise assets in sort of the server software market. And so they're definitely coming out strong with that hybrid value prop, and I think are going to be a driver within the numbers you're seeing on the screen on both the public and private side. One thing we will get into a couple of slides later, so I won't touch on it too much, is the fact that sort of obviously infrastructure, you can see the green bars are the tallest here, but also the public cloud infrastructure being the overwhelming majority of revenue. And so we'll get into that a little bit later, but obviously there's a big driver there from AWS, just being the far and away market leader when you look at infrastructure as a service as a whole. I think the one more notable driver of some of the future growth of this market is really what we're seeing in high-performance computing needs, especially around artificial intelligence and things like that. There's a lot of growth opportunity there for vendors to who are offering different high-performance computing flavors of their infrastructure in order to host really compute-intensive workloads like artificial intelligence and machine learning. So lots of growth opportunity there among sort of a bevy of other factors, but just a couple notable ones there.
All right. So that was our forecast of the market, and so now we're going to switch gears a little bit into, what we're hearing from CIOs themselves. Mm-hmm. And so I really think that, being able to choose deployment methods at the workload level due to, kind of organizational and IT acceptance of hybrid environments and the growing number of hybrid enabling tools, platform services that are coming to market is really helping bring organizations forward in their digital transformation, so to speak, and it's basically increasing their cloud spend and essentially driving cloud to be a larger component of their overall IT environments. And especially as hardware refresh cycles come to term, more and more organizations are going to be considering cloud alternatives, either public or private, as you just saw on the previous slide, and especially, again, for your infrastructure workloads. And this is especially true from what we've heard from retail CIOs, or at any business that's more seasonal or cyclical in nature, because often the sentiment is that it's frustrating to plan for peak capacity, in their own data centers and basically have all of this unused capacity for the majority of the year. And so a lot of the CIOs in retail are thinking, well, why not take the upfront cost of a cloud migration if that means kind of optimizing usage, especially over the long run, and especially kind of at that compute layer. And so doing this doesn't necessarily mean that the entire environment has to shift off-premises, rather a select workload or two that can be linked to kind of existing or on-prem or cloud assets. And a hybrid enabling force at play that really helps with this is the usage of Kubernetes. And it's, making and building applications Kubernetes native, especially as, Google and IBM come to market with really hybrid options that span public and private and on-premise infrastructure. So those Kubernetes native built apps can really help ease some of the pain points of kind of a sprawling hybrid environment. And from what we saw in the survey, 3/4 of respondents are already using one or more type of container platform, which really, to me, underscores how important portability is to help kind of utilize and optimize hybrid environments, but also as a means to avoid infrastructure lock-in. And that's just one example, and there's so many more. And Allan talked about it earlier, but about half of the respondents, indicated that they want hybrid, whether it's IT or cloud, as their end state. And whereas I think if we had asked that a few years ago, it would have been a much smaller percentage and a lot more people looking to all public or all private without having really experienced what a true kind of cloud migration really entails. And I think that we're just going to see the percentage of respondents that desire kind of a hybrid end state continue to uptick. And I think that that's also going to help, like this respondent in this quote here, he said basically we're at 25% now, but in the next few years, I think we can really get up to that 70% range in the cloud. And I think that, being able to utilize some of these kind of hybrid enabling solutions is going to help him make that happen. Okay.
So I think this is the point that Cassandra just made on the prior slide, specifically what that CIO said, I think really drives home a point when you look at this graph. So this is, just to orientate orient you to this graph. It's 2018 infrastructure as a service, revenue by vendor across both public and private. And so when you think about in the context of what the CIO said on the previous slide, that they're only about 25% of the way there, and in the next 3 years expect to be 70% of the way there, be that percentage of workloads or percentage of budget is not necessarily the point, but when you look at the size of this market, in particular AWS, and you think about the amount of customers that probably fall into that same camp of really only being about 25% of the way there is really massive growth opportunity over the next 3 to 5 years and definitely beyond. But I think that quote just really brings it into perspective. So what's interesting here is, I mean, Amazon is obviously sort of a market maker in general in the infrastructure as a service market. And so that's really afforded them the lead that they have. So the other difference between AWS and sort of the rest of the field as we look at this graph is that AWS is definitely, although they have the platform tools, they're innovating, and we'll touch on that in a minute, but they're innovating across the PaaS space, but they really are still an infrastructure-led vendor, particularly in comparison to other vendors like IBM and Microsoft and Google, who are definitely platform led in terms of some of the use cases they're talking about. And I think that was a necessary shift in order to sort of try to win some share against AWS and just the mind share that AWS has established, but definitely two different sort of general approaches to the market. The thing that Amazon continues to really try to separate itself based on innovation, even though there've definitely been proof points recently where it hasn't necessarily been the innovator. Amazon they're innovating, but not in sort of the leading sense that they'd like to say was always the rule. I think AWS Outpost is probably the prime example there, where it was actually a couple of years behind its competition. And so that just sort of highlights that there's definitely exceptions to the rule and places where other vendors are able to differentiate, at least in the near term. I think another aspect, particularly to IBM and Microsoft, is the legacy portfolios that both of those businesses have and are able to utilize as part of a more comprehensive hybrid IT story. That's something that Amazon doesn't quite have. They're working that way with Outpost, but it's not the same legacy software story. They're really relying on VMware and that partnership to enable that message. So just definitely different approaches to the market. But there's a couple of things that came out of this round of interviews that were really interesting, and some were just confirming factors, and some were really interesting nuances to what we'd otherwise accept as the rule. I think one of the confirming factors was a couple of different respondents just confirming that AWS continues to be sort of the top of mind vendor. So when considering things like the need for global points of presence, AWS is a go-to for sort of baseline infrastructure needs, such as sort of a point of presence in Australia, or we had one respondent talk a little bit about a point of presence that they need in China because of the government's restriction around some of the data that can go in and out of the country. The vendor was actually having, or the customer was having trouble hosting a geopositioning application, which is definitely a niche need, but was able to solve that by using a point of presence inside of sort of the Chinese borders to serve their own customers there. Within that same customer conversation, sort of think of those points of presence as the traditional things you'd think of when you hear sort of global infrastructure as a service vendor, in particular AWS. But one of the nuances, and was really a unique take for me, was this CIO in particular spoke about the industry lead employed by AWS actually reached out to him. his spend was not very high with the company, but they were a big enough brand that the AWS industry lead reached out and actually went out of their way to really ask the questions about what is your business problem? I'm not here to talk to you about technology. I'm here to solve your business problem, and went out of his way to do exactly that. And that made a big impression on this client. I think it really sold him on AWS as a vendor, where they were still making some of those early decisions that Cassandra had been talking about before. Sort of, I would bucket him even well below that 25% bracket. And that one gesture and that one effort by an industry lead to learn a little bit about the business and help solve a business problem rather than just pitch technology really made a difference. And I think that kind of thing, that's a storyline that's holding across a lot of customers. I think that's something that Google is trying to capitalize on right now with some of their account teams. But if AWS is putting in that same effort, they definitely have the position to capitalize on that more broadly. So just an interesting nuance there that we don't hear often about the AWS business. I think one other thing to touch on, sort of circling back to that position that AWS likes to hold as a sort of a leading innovator. We've heard mixed reviews over the course of our studies on really what those innovations mean to customers and how consumable they are. I mean, when you're launching thousands of features and services a year, you can't expect every CIO even to keep pace with those launches. And so definitely heard a mixed bag from customers. Some customers continue to say that the amount of service launches are not consumable and really can't be used to their greatest capacity because the customers aren't sure which services to use in which situations. But another customer really confirmed that innovation is keeping AWS above most of the competition. In general, I think he summed it up that for about 85% of the solutions that AWS, or the solutions that his company needs, AWS kind of just meets the functionality of other third-party tools he's using. And so he's really giving Amazon a lot of credit that they know their customer base, they know to what degree to invest in a certain area. They're sort of getting to the point where the couple of really important security and encryption tools are better than average, and then some of the other sort of lower value management tools are kind of just really average, but that they know their customer base well and that they're innovating right into that sweet spot of not too far, not too complex, but also sort of just meeting the functionality. So a lot of different nuances coming out, I think, in vendor adoption throughout the study, but definitely just wanted to hit on those because they were pretty, some were confirming and some were really just new and interesting.
Okay. All right. So now we're going to get into some of the industry views to kind of round this out. And again, I want to preface it with, again, it's a kind of a mixed bag, so to speak. So there are pros and cons to basically every which situation, depending on the organization, the CIO, and the industry that it plays in. And so before we get into some of the specific nuances by industry or some of the highlights, I guess, I really want to underscore that this is where a lot of the cloud migration obstacles come to the surface and really start to present themselves. And that's really when it comes to industry use cases specifically. And so a lot of health and financial services CIOs kind of indicated that they were looking to their quote-unquote industry leaders to be the first movers and await signs of success or failure with whatever technology adoption they're kind of considering, really before they themselves make a big push into something. So inherently, these industries are kind of slower to move in many cases, slower to adopt, and then also slower to make larger scale changes. And looking at financial services specifically, I think the first mistake a lot of people make when looking at this industry is looking at it as one industry. So if you take SaaS, for example, SaaS, yes, is one market, but you're not really going to compare Adobe to Workday. because the two specialize in very different areas, arguably different markets altogether, and have different business models, different pricing models. And I think that the same can be applied to financial services. It's an industry that encompasses banks, insurance providers, investment bankers, stockbrokers, mutual funds, you name it. So it's inherently fragmented, and the needs that, say, a global bank or even a regional bank may have, and the challenges that it might face, are distinctly separate from, say, what a life insurance company would care about or need. And so if you've read the quote on this slide, this particular CIO is specifically outside of the banking sub-industry or micro-vertical that many, myself included, think of, when you look at financial services. And I just find it really interesting because the most critical business function that this company does are research and trading, things that they want to keep very close to the vest. And, they have yet to find a vendor that they think is secure enough to be able to move these workloads or functions to a more modern environment. Again, that's just one example and is kind of in contrast with some of the other CIOs in financial services that we talked to that sounded kind of like a broken record in talking about all they cared about was PCI compliance, whereas this person didn't mention it once. So again, and neither are wrong. Both make sense for their individual businesses and the spaces that they play. But I think that that's just a fundamental reason why we can't look at financial services as one industry and kind of lump everything together, lump the pain points and the solutions together in that sense.
All right, and another really interesting sort of industry nuance that we've heard before and I think was just really sort of doubled down on in some of the interviews that we had this quarter is in the healthcare space. And so similar to what Cassandra just explained, there's definitely micro-vertical nuances within sort of healthcare and life sciences. There's anywhere from kind of touching on the financial services industry, so the financial, the insurance payers versus the actual sort of doctors who deal with patient data. So there's a really broad spectrum of concerns across sort of the broader healthcare and life sciences industry. But one of the things that I think often comes up when you're talking about healthcare is HIPAA compliance. And HIPAA compliance is nothing new, but as data breaches and conversations around customer data are really at the forefront of sort of topical areas in the industry, I think personal information in general kind of fits into those conversations. And so when you think about healthcare data and personal health records, those are definitely topics of concern, and healthcare providers are very cognizant of the risks of holding on to that data. And so this in particular CIO in the healthcare industry was highlighting that even the fact that the AWSs and Azures of the world are certified for HIPAA compliance, he still doesn't want to deal with the risk of holding or being responsible for the infrastructure that is hosting patients' information. And so really going beyond moving his systems to Amazon or Azure, this particular CIO really wants to completely de-risk his own IT organization and leverage vendors that provide very stringent SLAs and own the risk across the whole tech stack. So that's something where this CIO is really pushing towards a completely hosted, completely managed environment where he's completely de-risked. I think similarly we talked to another CIO in the healthcare industry who was talking about his decision to choose between either Cerner or McKesson, and this was not necessarily a very recent decision, but a few years ago was deciding between Cerner and McKesson, and McKesson was his legacy provider, legacy software provider for his EMR, but as he was evaluating new vendors, Cerner was really leading with this cloud-first strategy, pushing their cloud version through as their really preferred option, and doing so with really aggressive timelines. He had mentioned that it was sort of a 6-month go live rather than what would be a 3-year go live on McKesson. And so between those factors, matched with a very aggressive SLA, I think you can see that as a recurring theme, that customer in particular went with Cerner because it completely de-risked his operation while providing really high accessibility and SLAs. So definitely a flavor of the healthcare industry really going after that de-risking. But we also have talked to, again, this goes back to those nuances. We talked to another customer who was mentioning the change management aspect in the healthcare industry, that healthcare, in his eyes, he was definitely sort of at that more healthcare provider level, dealing with the doctors in particular that these companies have spent, I think he phrased it as, I don't have the quote from me, but millions of dollars to recruit. There are certain doctors who are very valuable assets to healthcare providers that are not willing to embrace some of this newer technology, not willing to move to the cloud. And when you're looking at a company who has invested millions and millions of dollars in their assets on the ground, and those assets don't want to adopt technology that may be cloud-based. I mean, as simple as trying to get a doctor to change from handwritten notes to using a tablet or a laptop, I mean, that's still a very, very real hindrance in these environments. And so there's organizations who face that sort of change management issue who really can't adopt systems in a cost-effective manner. They could adopt these and sort of bridge the gaps between the doctor and the systems, but there's a point where the headache is just too much, and they don't see sort of a path to get themselves to these more fully hosted and fully managed by a third-party environment. So again, another industry where there's just massive differences based on microvertical. And so hospitality is our last industry view for this quarter. I think this was a really interesting one that we don't get to hear from quite as much. And so we were lucky enough to have a few different respondents out of the hospitality industry this quarter. And the interesting thing is you think of hotels as, I mean, generally pretty similar operations, but even within this hospitality industry, there's the differences in customer adoption. In particular, we talked to one CIO who was, I kind of use the age-old line of I'm in the hospitality business, I'm not in IT, which is, you think, odd for a CIO to say, but there are definitely CIOs who are getting very comfortable kind of taking that idea of being able to speak to the business and really embracing that and letting go of those IT reins and embracing the solving the business problem sort of mindset. So that was the same CIO who I mentioned earlier was sort of using AWS to put a point of presence in China in order to host the geopositioning application there. He's still very much a early stage adopter, but really a cloud-first mentality, but doing so in a manner to reduce the management of IT that he has to do. whereas he actually was someone who gave us a little bit more insight into one of his competitors in the hospitality space, who is similarly utilizing AWS, but doing so in a manner to develop a custom system that they are then reselling to mom and pop shops. So two different CIOs in almost identical businesses taking two very different approaches to cloud adoption and really IT management overall. So just really interesting nuances across the board in hospitality. And I think that's really the last bit of industry we have and the last bit on the topic. So we'll open up the line for questions. I know we had a couple come in while we were talking. So if you want, we'll answer the first few, and you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit any additional questions as we go through these first few.
So one of the questions that recently came through, I'll ask it and then I'll answer it. So the question is, if adoption of cloud is slow in financial services and insurance and in healthcare, where are the first movers now appearing in the market? I originally read that question as asking about which industries are first to adopt. Okay. So the way, especially from more recent conversations, but over time as well, as we've done this program for quite a few years now, I personally look at retail as being a first mover. There's a lot of applications available for retail organizations that really help streamline processes and what have you. Hospitality as well, I think, is another industry that is moving along the curve at a decent pace. And a couple others that we didn't really talk too much about today, but we've had very interesting conversations with, and there's a lot going on in terms of especially analytics and ERP adoption, or cloud ERP adoption, I should say, are kind of the oil, gas, utility space, telco, and then also manufacturing. And one of the manufacturing folks that we talked to basically called out that cloud is now a necessity for them because as a kind of a disaster recovery measure. So they have a big manufacturing location in Manhattan, and when Hurricane Sandy hit, it destroyed them. And so their manufacturing process didn't go down, but their data center did. And so that was basically their ERP system going down halted the manufacturing process. So they want their ERP, I think the phrase he used was to be eternally up. So that's kind of what prompted them to move to cloud, as just an example. Let's see.
So another question that came in was, I think about the graph that we were showing, that those green bars where AWS is much higher. And so this question asks, AWS is much larger than Microsoft than I expected based on Microsoft's traction with Azure. So why do you think that is?
I can answer that. This is Jack. So AWS, first of all, is infrastructure as a service led, whereas Microsoft is more of a PaaS-led strategy. And AWS is unmatched in mindshare in the public's infrastructure as a service space, and has been able to grow at a rapid rate because of innovation, kind of expanding on what Meaghan was saying earlier. And it has been innovating around workloads that it wishes to win and has successfully been doing so, and that's around Oracle, SAP, Microsoft legacy workloads. And one example of that, recent innovation around Microsoft's legacy workloads that AWS has is its new scripting tool that simplifies the migration of SQL Server workloads from Windows to Linux, rather, and another Windows file server, to support the workloads as is in an AWS environment. So these are workloads that could be an easy win for Microsoft because it's already in Microsoft's legacy customer base that could be moved to Azure, but AWS is finding ways to poach these customers in addition to other enterprises that are looking to migrate to a private cloud, public cloud, hybrid IT environment, which we saw earlier. And these innovations that I just mentioned that AWS had came to be right as Microsoft is expecting to end extended support for Windows Server 2008. So that's going to be in January 2019, I believe, and that'll give an opportunity for AWS to jump on those Windows Server customers.
Great. Thanks, Jack. Another question that came through is, the pendulum always swings from local to central and back in computing, especially with the growth of edge computing. Do you think there is a risk that moving everything to the cloud and then shooting the talent will backfire over time?
Yeah, so this is Allan. I can take that because I think you have seen, I think you've seen some of the calls for everything that moves to cloud, or, the case studies of closing all of your data centers and moving everything to AWS. Those have died down. We've definitely seen some of the traditional infrastructure companies talk a lot about cloud repatriation, moving, workloads moving off public cloud environments on the other side of the spectrum. I think the truth lies somewhere in between, but really it is a current net migration to cloud environments that I don't think that's a fad. I don't think that's going to move backwards at any point in the future. It may balance a bit, but I think we're still on that upward curve in terms of the right mix of computing solutions. And even with more growth in terms of edge computing, I think part of it may not be all AWS or some of the big public cloud vendors. I think co-location is going to play a big role, and the concept of sharing of resources and having someone else foot the bill for the infrastructure, even if it moves to a combination of an edge to a centralized cloud environment, is one that's going to endure. You've even seen AWS move into, I believe, offering base stations for edge and IoT use cases. So they're not going to let that model come in and disrupt them. They're going to be part of the growth in terms of edge computing and those types of use cases.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Okay, another question that came in, I think this is for you, Meaghan, regarding your China comment about placing a point of presence there. Define how that affects security considerations.
So I'm not sure if that's meant to be the security considerations in terms of the customer's data, or the security considerations in terms of the vendor having to co-locate within China. So maybe I'll tee up a little bit more about the specific situation that was described to us, because it was pretty interesting that, so it was in terms of an application where you're sort of doing the search my location function for hotels. So you're looking at a map and you're saying, where am I, where are the closest hotels at, and at what rates. When you're a customer in China trying to access that sort of interface that's owned by a company that's not located in China, the government actually has a firewall that restricted Chinese customers from accessing that service. And so they would log in to the website and just not be able to ping where they are on the map. And so that was the real issue that he was trying to overcome. And so by using a local point of presence and doing the processing for that particular function in country, it enabled the vendor to enable the my location function in their application, which in their perspective was a really critical function of their their online booking offering. It was really critical to getting customers to embrace maybe some of the higher priced hotels or more premium services, being able to figure out how close the customer was and things like that. I don't believe that the data was ever really able to be utilized outside of the country. I think that still falls under some of the regulations there. But there is definitely a conversation going on, particularly amongst some other customers, about leveraging the metadata of customer information outside of country restrictions. And so that's definitely sort of a nuance to this conversation that we'll be watching as some of the data management providers talk a little bit more about metadata. I know that's something that came up in our conversations this quarter, that Microsoft Azure is actually pretty weak in their metadata capabilities, just from at least the perspective of one of our IDI respondents. So definitely an interesting area to consider. I mean, especially given the global restrictions on sort of data localization. Okay,
great. Well, I think that we're just about up on the hour. I know there's a couple more questions that we will follow up on via email. You will get a response, so continue to submit more of those so we can follow up. And I'll hand it over to Sarah to do the final regards here.
All right, everyone, please feel free to reach out to the team with any follow-up questions. If you have a few moments, please fill out the survey on your screen. We would greatly appreciate it. A replay version of the webcast will be available after the event and will be sent out to you via email. To view a list of our upcoming and past webinars, please visit tbri.com. Be sure to join us Wednesday, May 15th for 30 Minutes, 3 Months, 3 Years, Evolution of Digital Transformation. Thank you and have a great day.